Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
History as it happens, September 19th, 2024. The Biden Doctrine revisited.
The battle between democracy and autocracies. Democracies are rising to the moment, and the world is clearly choosing the side of peace and security. This is the real test. I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. To those asking for a third decade of war in Afghanistan, I ask, what is the vital national interest? This grouping of democratic partners who share a worldview and have a common vision for the future, coming together to take on key challenges of our age.
Is there a Biden Doctrine? What did it achieve? Where did it fail? The president, whose term is winding down, sought to reset U.S. foreign policy after the unilateralism of the Trump years. But there are always continuities from one administration to the next. And whatever we might call a strategy, since 1945, they've all been designed to maintain U.S. primacy. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
A doctrine, in my mind, is one specific idea, one specific policy that transcends the day-to-day. Obviously, the Monroe Doctrine. No European country should continue to colonize in the Western Hemisphere. The Truman Doctrine. We will aid any people that are against communist aggression.
One of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion.
The Carter Doctrine. We are willing to use force, including nuclear weapons, to defend the freedom of oil coming out of the Middle East.
In an essay for Foreign Affairs, Jessica T. Matthews, a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, writes, although it is too soon to judge the historical significance of Joe Biden's one-term presidency, it's clear the past 4 years have witnessed remarkable achievements in foreign policy. Biden has made some notable strategic mistakes as well, mostly when he chose to follow the policies of his predecessor, Donald Trump. But he has carried out a crucial task, she writes, shifting the basis of American foreign policy from an unhealthy reliance on military intervention to the active pursuit of diplomacy backed by strength. He has won back the trust of friends and allies, built and begun to institutionalize a deep American presence in Asia, restored the United States' role in essential multilateral organizations and agreements, and ended the longest of the country's forever wars, a step none of his 3 predecessors had the courage to take.
To those asking for a third decade of war in Afghanistan, I ask, what is the vital national interest? In my view, we only have one: to make sure Afghanistan can never be used again to launch an attack on our homeland. Remember why we went to Afghanistan in the first place? Because we were attacked by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda on September 11th, 2001. And they were based in Afghanistan. We delivered justice to bin Laden on May 2nd, 2011, over a decade ago. Al-Qaeda was decimated. I respectfully suggest you ask yourself this question. If we'd been attacked on September 11, 2001, from Yemen instead of Afghanistan, would we have ever gone to war in Afghanistan? Even though the Taliban controlled Afghanistan in the year 2001?
And I'll share a link to the essay in my weekly newsletter. Sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. Again, it was Jessica T. Matthews writing in Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. She goes on to praise Biden's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, gives him a mixed review when it comes to China, and says his record in the Middle East is disappointing. I would call it disastrous. More on that in a bit. Whatever the results, did President Biden, who has little more than 3 months left as the most powerful office holder in the world, did he craft a doctrine? You might say he diagnosed a problem. Democracies are, in fact, in retreat or under pressure, and authoritarian states are repressing internal dissent while waging aggressive war in the case of Russia or economic coercion in the case of China.
Freedom House reports in 2020 that marked the 15th consecutive year of global freedom in retreat. Another recent report from the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance noted more than half of all democracies have experienced a decline in at least one aspect of their democracy over the last 10 years, including the United States.
Biden's embrace of U.S. alliances and multilateral action are nothing new, of course. A doctrine is an actionable idea, such as the Truman Doctrine, containment of communism, the Reagan Doctrine, rollback of communism, the Bush Doctrine after 9/11, preventive war, unilaterally if necessary. Past doctrines shared something in common. They viewed the world as divided into two opposing, irreconcilable camps: freedom versus communism or radical Islam, and now it is autocracy. The U.S. has rarely applied its principles consistently while pursuing a doctrine. The results have been disastrous by supporting dictators in the Third World, overthrowing democratically elected leaders, or fighting ruinous wars in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. We've been over these issues many times on the podcast over the past 3.5 years. So, in my view, President Biden is not an innovative or visionary foreign policy president. And he, of course, understands the world is messier than democracies in one corner, autocracies in the other. More now with Jeffrey Engel, founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. He is the author of When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Welcome back, Jeffrey Engel.
Always great to talk to you.
How does Jeffrey Engel define the Biden doctrine? Does he have one?
I don't think so, but I don't want that to be a critique, because my sense of Joe Biden's foreign policy is that it was a reversion to the mean, the normal of American foreign policy since 1945. In fact, I often tell my students that there are certain things that every American president believes in for foreign policy. We can get into that list. But then I point out that there's actually, I can't say that anymore. There's one exception, and that's Donald Trump, who doesn't believe a lot of the central premises of American foreign policy, including the importance of alliances, the importance of collective security, the importance of free trade, et cetera.
Broadly speaking, I agree with you, but you said he reverted to the mean. What was the mean? Yeah, you're right. He talked about getting back with our alliances, et cetera, standing up for democracy versus autocracy. And I want to get into that idea of looking at the world as divided between two camps, because that's certainly not new, right? That goes all the way back to 1947 and the Truman Doctrine. But one message that Biden said, if not explicitly, this is my interpretation of it anyway, when he took office, was American foreign policy had become a mess, not just because of Trump, but, the war in Afghanistan had gone through how many different presidential administrations. So he was saying we can't keep fighting the war on terrorism the same way forever. We also need to rely on soft power. And I'm not sure that Biden really did get away from that, but I think that was his aim.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I think it reinforces just how dramatic 9/11 was, because it forced the Bush administration into a position that I don't think the president would have approved of on September 10th. Remember, George W. Bush was the one in his campaign who said he didn't believe in nation building. And then what do? After you invade countries, you have to build them back up again. So if we look at the patterns that develop after George W. Bush, Barack Obama also had to come in and say the same things that Joe Biden has, which is America is back. America is back as a multilateral player. America is not going to be unilateral. America is not going to just work from the point of a gun.
Our values, talking about our values.
Well, talking about our values, but without imposing our values on others. Remember, the freedom agenda for George W. Bush was bringing freedom to other people, and we get to define what their freedom looks like. I do like to point out that Barack Obama, you might recall, won the Nobel Peace Prize in his first year of office to his great embarrassment, because he and his aides were quite clear that he had done nothing to deserve it.
And he wound up bombing how many different countries?
Right. And he didn't want it. And he actually said that in his Nobel speech. You can't give the Peace Prize to a guy whose job it is to order military strikes.
But perhaps the most profound issue surrounding my receipt of this prize is the fact that I am the commander-in-chief of the military of a nation in the midst of two wars. One of these wars is winding down. The other is a conflict that America did not seek, one in which we are joined by 42 other countries, including Norway, in an effort to defend ourselves and all nations from further attacks. Still, we are at war. And I'm responsible for the deployment of thousands of young Americans to battle in a distant land. And some will kill, and some will be killed.
The only thing that Barack Obama had done to deserve the Nobel Peace Prize was that the world basically said, thank God you're not George W. Bush.
He gave a speech, too, in Cairo, did he not? That had something to do with this, or am I getting the speeches mixed
No, he
up?
did. He gave a speech in Cairo earlier. But,
the rhetoric versus the action. So we're going to talk about continuities and how different doctrines might obscure the continuities between presidential administrations and really the national security state. We're dealing with a large structure here, often what I call structural criminality. We can get back to my editorializing later, but go ahead. You were in the middle of a point there.
Well, so I think Joe Biden had a similar process. The previous president, George W. Bush or Donald Trump, had been perceived by the world as more interested in American foreign policy as an American first agenda, as doing what's best for the United States. Every president has an America first agenda. It's just a matter of how you get there. For most presidents, this is why I say reverting to the mean, they realize that American leadership and, frankly, the expenditure of American effort, diplomatically, militarily, morally, et cetera, was ultimately going to lead to a better life for Americans and better security for Americans. So when Joe Biden came into office, the first thing he had to do was remind everyone that Americans were about leading the free world, whatever that term still means, leading our allies, being a cooperative player, not just, as Trump perceived it, as a transactional member of the international community.
Yeah, agreed. I think, though, the West is increasingly talking to itself when it talks of the rules-based order and the free world, as you put it. If I were to define a Biden doctrine, it would be his framing of all conflicts between two camps. It's democracy versus autocracy. Where does Saudi Arabia fall in all of that? The reality on the ground, realpolitik or geopolitical concerns are also driving Biden administration decision-making. So they're not applying this principle of democracy versus autocracy consistently.
And I would use the word complexity. And this is one of the great points I think that the article that we're discussing from Foreign Affairs really makes quite well. The Biden administration, leading from the president's own voice, believing that he needed to restore American democracy at home and preserve American democracy. And I do think that's actually fundamentally why he decided to run for office in 2020. Took that one further step and said that we are living in a world of autocracy versus democracy. And it's a Manichaean bipolar world. And then it's almost as soon as the president said that, I think he realized, and his advisors certainly were telling him ahead of time, the world is full of shades of gray. What is a democracy? And frankly, would Texas qualify as a democracy? People might argue, given the voting rights of our state, they would not.
Well, Turkey is one country. Saudi Arabia is another that comes to mind. I mean, Turkey is NATO.
And even Hungary. Hell, you could even make the argument the Soviet Union used to have elections too. So if you think about Biden's rhetoric, and I think this is a fair and legitimate critique against him from a historical perspective, he comes into office talking about wanting to be as foundational and transformational as the New Deal. He wants to be the next Franklin Roosevelt. And that rhetoric doesn't survive Congress. Similarly, he comes in saying that we're living in a Manichaean world of democracies versus autocracies.
I think we're in a contest, not with China per se, but a contest with autocrats, autocratic governments around the world, as to whether or not democracies can compete with them in the rapidly changing 21st century.
He still wants, when he thinks about the world, he still wants the world to be divided up into countries that are with us morally, philosophically, and countries that are antagonistic to us.
An Atlanticist, it's been described as, an Atlanticist worldview, pro-NATO worldview. To his credit, he has reinforced our relationships in Asia, for instance, the so-called Quad countries. We'll get into some of this. When it comes to the most important issue of all, and that is putting an end to our forever wars, he did show relative restraint, and he did make the right decision. And relative restraint, what am I talking about? He didn't start any new unnecessary wars, which I guess is a positive considering how many there have been. But he made the right decision to get the United States out of Afghanistan, even though the way it was handled at the end, we all know, was bloody chaos.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
There has been a suicide bombing at Kabul airport in Afghanistan where crowds were gathered in the hope of getting...
These American service members who gave their lives, it's an overused word, but it's totally appropriate here, were heroes. Heroes who have been engaged in a dangerous, selfless mission to save the lives of others.
As a general proposition, we give presidents way too much credit and give them way too much blame. The president's job is to make that most difficult decision of saying, ultimately, do we stay or do we go? After that, his job is done. You know, he sits back and tells the generals and tells the diplomats, get this done. So he is responsible, and he took responsibility for the chaos that was the pullout. But I think ultimately it's hard to imagine how a pullout would have not been chaotic.
Well, in my view, the mistake was underestimating how quickly the Taliban was going to take over the country. But I've covered that on other episodes. And
but that raises, in a sense, even greater justification for pulling out. Because if we were there for 20 years and we spent, what was it, $3 trillion, $2 trillion?
About $300 million a day on average. Yeah.
Crazy. I mean, what could we do with $300 million a day in America?
My point was going to be that overall, that was the correct decision. To me, it had been a no-brainer. I'd been calling for it, not that anyone listens to me, for many, many years. But we know that when you are the decider, the fallout is going to fall on you, right? It is a difficult decision for any American president to make, essentially admitting that you have lost a war. And the United States did lose that war. So he did make the right move to put an end to that failed project because, as Jessica Matthews pointed out in her piece in Foreign Affairs, U.S. attention and energies have to be placed elsewhere.
Well, and if we've spent 20 years and several $1 trillion and army that we trained and the government that we helped establish can't last 72 hours, I don't put that at the feet of the person who makes the decision to pull out. I put that at the feet of the people who were there for the 20 years before, which includes Vice President Biden. But that tells us these allies were not strong enough to stand on their own. And that was going to be obvious whether it took, as Nixon and Kissinger would have said, a decent interval.
Mr. President, there had not been a U.S. service member killed in combat in Afghanistan since February of 2020. You set a deadline, you pulled troops out, you sent troops back in, and now 12 Marines are dead. You said the buck stops with you. Do you bear any responsibility for the way that things have unfolded in the last 2 weeks?
I bear responsibility for fundamentally all that's happened of late. But here's the deal. You know, I wish you'd one day say these things. You know as well as I do that the former president made a deal with the Taliban that he would get all American forces out of Afghanistan by May 1. In return, the commitment was made, and that was a year before. In return, he was given a commitment that the Taliban would continue to attack others, but would not attack any American forces. Remember that? I'm being serious. No, I'm asking you a question. Because before... No, wait a minute. I'm asking you a question. Is that accurate, the best?
talking about, but Mr. President, respectfully, since I don't think that the issue that, do you think that people have an issue with pulling out of Afghanistan or just the way that things have happened?
I think they have an issue that people are likely to get hurt. Some, as we've seen, have gotten killed, and that it is messy. Imagine where we'd be if I had indicated on May the 1st I was not going to renegotiate an evacuation date. We were going to stay there. I'd have only one alternative: pour thousands of more troops back into Afghanistan.
What is a presidential doctrine? Because some presidents have them and some don't.
A doctrine, in my mind, is one specific idea, one specific policy that transcends the day-to-day. Obviously, the Monroe Doctrine. No European country should continue to colonize in the Western Hemisphere. The Truman Doctrine. We will aid any people that are against communist aggression.
One of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion.
The Carter Doctrine. We are willing to use force, including nuclear weapons, to defend the freedom of oil coming out of the Middle East.
Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
Big ideas, big one-sentence ideas. I don't know that Joe Biden had that, and I don't think that's a critique, because I don't want to live in a world where my president needs to, every 4 years, come up with a new big picture, one-line issue.
Well, I think a doctrine is helped by the presence of an easily defined enemy. We have talked about democracy versus autocracy, although I think that's a foolish way of looking at the world, and I'm not sure how close the Biden, as we've been discussing, the Biden administration really stuck to that anyway, because it deals with Saudi Arabia. Its position in the Middle East, in my view, is certainly not in support of democracy if you care about the national aspirations of Palestinians. When it comes to doctrines, though, as you've been explaining here, a big one-sentence idea, but sometimes these doctrines can be concerned with more realist or geostrategic interests, right? For instance, the Carter Doctrine was very much about the flow of oil in the Middle East after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Each of these doctrines is complicated. Think back to the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, given in 1905, just to remind your listeners, is essentially Roosevelt's statement that civilized nations, by the way, he gets to decide what's a civilized nation, should have and do have the right to intervene to keep law and order in uncivilized places. What's interesting about that is he is able to differentiate what is and is not a place that we should use our power. So he uses that power, declares that power, that the United States should go in and impose order, if you will, law and order in Central America and in Latin America. He doesn't do it in Russia when there's pogroms going on that he also clearly is against, and he speaks out against them very clearly, very explicitly. But this is not a moment for the United States to use its power. So I had an international relations professor, I think maybe even International Relations 101, who made the point that important to remember in international affairs is can does not imply should. Roosevelt was saying with his doctrine, we can intervene when necessary. That doesn't mean we are forced to do so every time.
What you're saying has made me think of a sentence in John W. Dower's book, Cultures of War. By the way, I have a different Dower book I'm going to cite in a little bit when we're talking about continuities between administrations. But Dower wrote in Cultures of War, language and rhetoric become a prison. So, to your point, if you're going to say we are doing this because the U.S. has a responsibility, a la the Truman Doctrine, 1947, to contain communism, we can also draw a parallel to Biden democracy versus autocracy, right? Ukraine is the front line in this global struggle. But you have to be careful there because you trap yourself into having to defend this idea. When everyone knows the United States is not going to fight a direct war with Russia over the independence of Ukraine. So doctrines can be dangerous. Can be dangerous. They are dangerous. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and they're dangerous because they can be used as political cudgels as well. Remember, this is basically the heart of the matter of the most famous case of civilian-military relations that every American officer learns ad nauseum.
I know where you're going with this, yeah.
That is the firing of MacArthur. Truman, there's a war going on in Korea. Truman's president, MacArthur's commander of American forces and of UN forces, and MacArthur starts agitating to bomb China from where supplies and troops are coming, and then starts agitating to bomb China with nuclear weapons. Truman orders him as the president to stop talking about this because that's not what we want to do. MacArthur does two things. First, he keeps talking about it, violation of direct order. And secondly, he makes the argument that, listen, we're at war with communism. The Truman Doctrine says we're at war with communism. The people of China need liberation just as much as the people of North Korea, as much as the people of South Korea. If we have it within our ability to liberate people, we need to do it. Truman's argument is, I wrote the doctrine. I understand what I said. And that doesn't mean that it's a suicide pact, that we have to go into wars where we're going to lose, including invading mainland China.
To remind everyone, the Truman speech in 1947 was about aid to Greece and Turkey.
It is necessary only to glance at a map to realize that the survival and integrity of the Greek nation are of grave importance in a much wider situation. If Greece should fall under the control of an armed minority, the effect upon its neighbor Turkey would be immediate and serious. Confusion and disorder might well spread throughout the entire Middle East.
And in that speech, as Mary Ann Heiss points out in an essay for the journal Diplomatic History that was written this year, so it's a new journal article, she points out that even in that speech, Truman admitted that the Greek government was not perfect. It wasn't on the side of freedom, in other words, despite this framing of the world into two camps. For instance, the Greek prison population had doubled to more than 16,000 people, and they were doing some not very nice things to those prisoners. So, she writes, as a result, the United States sacrificed support for real democracy on the altar of anti-communism. I mean, that goes on throughout the entire Cold War, supporting rotten governments because they were opposed to communist insurgents or communist infiltration, what have you. Where was I going with this long introduction to what should...
Can I say a quick thing about that?
Yeah.
This is one of those moments where you realize as a professor that not only are you old, but you're also old and outdated. Because I used to give a lecture on the Cold War where I said, everything you need to understand about the Cold War can be understood by watching the movie City Slickers. Because remember, in City Slickers, Curly says, there's just one thing you got to figure out. And Billy Crystal constantly says, what's the one thing? What's the one thing? And Curly says, that's for you to figure out. My point being that the Cold War is paramount. Beating the Soviets is paramount. You want to understand why we supported any government, why we took any policy, why we did any particular action during the Cold War. It's because the most important thing was defeating the Soviets. I have to tell you, I made this point the last time a couple of years ago when I realized not only did the students, none of them had seen the movie. I asked them, none of them had heard of the movie. So,
well, there you go.
Analogies get old too.
Do you know what the secret of life is?
No, what?
This.
Your finger?
One thing. Just one thing. You stick to that and everything else don't mean shit.
That's great, but what's the one thing?
That's what you gotta figure out.
I wasn't expecting City Slickers. I saw that movie once. I didn't really think it was very funny, but anyway, moving on.
Well, you clearly don't understand the Cold War.
Well, there's many things I don't understand. But, for people who are, younger than you and I, Generation Z or millennials, they grew up in a world where American foreign policy, led with the bayonet, the era of preemptive war.
Actually led with a drone is what I'd probably say.
That's right. Truman did not say the U.S. had to contain communism through direct military force, the application of direct military force. He did not want to go to war with the Soviet Union. And I think even a more important speech, or equally important, was his inaugural address in 1948, where Truman implicitly acknowledges in this decolonizing world that socialism is attractive to the peoples who are coming out from under the yoke of colonialism. So he talks about the importance of the United States donating its scientific and technological know-how in order to win friends in what was called the Third World. In other words, soft power is a big part of presidential doctrines, too.
We must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas.
I'm curious if you would include dollars as part of soft power or not. I can make a case either way, to be honest. But this is one of the central tenets, I would argue, of American foreign policy since 1945 that, again, every president except one has basically bought into. The idea, it was ultimately in our interest because it was cheaper to give aid and to help make strong allies than it was to go in and fight a war on their behalf. Bill Clinton said this constantly when he was trying to negotiate peace in Israel, obviously not successful, in which he said, the amount of aid that we're promising both of these countries is a pittance compared to what a single day of a war would cost us. So it's in our own interest to promote security and safety and to pay the price for it, because we actually should see that as an investment.
It's easy, for example, to say that we really have no interest in who lives in this or that valley in Bosnia, or who owns a strip of brushland in the Horn of Africa, or some piece of parched earth by the Jordan River. But the true measure of our interests lies not in how small or distant these places are, or in whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread? We cannot, indeed we should not, do everything or be everywhere. But where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so.
Yeah, I don't want to let Truman off easy. The U.S. military wrought enormous devastation, carpet bombing North Korea during the Korean War. So there was a hot war in there. But some presidents who've had successful foreign policies don't have a doctrine named after them. Namely, the president you wrote about in When the World Seemed New, which I can say honestly, not just saying that because you're a guest on the show, an excellent look at how George H.W. Bush handled the end of the Cold War. The way he managed that episode, which came on pretty suddenly, as what did Mark Twain say about bankruptcy? It happens gradually, then suddenly. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't adhere to a rigid ideology.
If you want to look for a Bush doctrine, you can probably find it more explicitly in his reaction to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. The idea that United Nations is paramount and that sovereignty and borders matter quite a bit. In terms of the end of the Cold War, I think his brilliant leadership was mostly about being quiet and being willing to be a moderator and a moderating force in the world, in a world that's increasingly chaotic, and also not needing to take the credit for it.
There you go.
Everything happens behind the scenes, which is why one of the reasons, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons he doesn't get a second term is he didn't ever let the American people know just how successful he had been in the first term, because successes never make the front page of the newspaper, only failures do.
Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more.
In my view, when it comes to not just presidential doctrines, but U.S. foreign policy post-1945, whatever we might call it, the strategies are different. Carter Doctrine, say, versus the Reagan Doctrine. Reagan wasn't about containment. It was about rollback, and we would give aid and comfort to some pretty nasty people, say, in Central America in order to do that. But the aim of all of them, at least during the Cold War, and even to this point, is maintaining U.S. primacy. And I'm going to share something with you from John Dower's book, The Violent American Century. This is about continuities. Dower says, when the administration of George Bush responded to September 11 by declaring a global war on terror and launching the disastrous invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, it was not really deviating from the thrust of existing policy, as so many have argued. The excessive response to the atrocity carried out by al-Qaeda's 19 terrorists essentially involved unleashing a war-fighting machine already primed and experienced in overseas interventions, including intensive bombing, covert operations, and practices on the dark side. So over the years, our enemies, generally speaking, change. Communists, Islamists, today it's autocrats, but the war-fighting machine is still there.
Well, yeah.
I mean, we're not carpet bombing the Houthis, but we have fired missiles at them.
I would argue, and I'm hardly the first person to say this, one of the signs of a declining empire is an overinvestment in security and overseas security in particular out of fear rather than building the infrastructure that created that industrial power to create the security in the first place.
And how about being unable to differentiate between vital interests and peripheral interests?
Well, also related. Everything starts to look dangerous to you. And we do have a remarkably impressive military that is designed to be lethal in a variety of different circumstances. Not every country has chosen to be as lethal in as many types of warfare. I would argue that that has led us to, because we have such a strong hammer, led us over time to see the world as every problem is a nail, when sometimes other solutions might be more useful. And this, I think, is actually an element of where Biden should deserve great praise, in my opinion, because he recognized, I think, in Ukraine, and then to a lesser extent in Israel, wars can get out of control very quickly. And it's better for the United States to restrain our allies, to give them aid, but not give them everything, to give them assistance, but not give them American blood. That ultimately will keep wars from spreading and wars from growing, even if it doesn't mean you have a very simple or quick solution to those wars.
So let's talk about Biden then in those two conflicts. His critics will say that he hasn't given Ukraine enough.
His critics are wrong.
And when it comes to Israel, I have to disagree with you. I think his approach here has been disastrous. And I did not say this at first, but we are now a year into this, and other than some mild public criticisms of Israel, he has yet to do the only thing an American president can do to change Israel's behavior, and that is cut off the weapons. You can go further than that, too. Push for the enforcement of UN resolutions dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict going back many, many decades.
Let's look at the Israel thing, because I fundamentally agree with you on the Israel thing. But let's play a counterfactual, look at it from the other direction. The other option for Joe Biden being president, both during his time and now again, is Donald Trump. And my argument is that Donald Trump would be less restraining on the Netanyahu government and on Israel than the Biden administration has been. We also don't know what's being said behind closed doors. So you and I can agree that we wish the Biden administration had imposed more restraints upon Israel. But I think we have to recognize that they are imposing restraints more than others would.
And it has still led to the wholesale destruction of Gaza, which is not in our interest. It is not in Israel's interest. Israeli military figures, past and present, have come out to say this is not working. We are not going to solve the...
And I don't blame Biden for that situation. He didn't create October 7th, he didn't create the response to October 7th. But absent American effort and restraint, what's the one thing that he wanted most of all when Joe Biden woke up on October 8th? Two things, really. He wanted to express support for Israel, and he wanted to make sure we didn't get a larger war that exploded out of this. Thus far, we've had a lot of tension, and we've got a lot of threat of war, but we have not had the wider war that people worried about on October 8th.
Yeah, I mean, the story is not...
about it systematically.
Story is not fully written yet. No, I do think his policy towards Israel has been a disaster, and we can disagree on that.
I'll agree it's a disaster, but I just think we have to give him credit for the fact that it hasn't been worse.
Meaning a regional war.
Right.
But it might be. I mean, it still could blow up into something like that. A ceasefire. Now, Netanyahu is more responsible than Biden, and Hamas as well. We can't forget about them.
I was going to say, let's not forget.
For the lack of the ceasefire. They're the principals here. But we're talking about American presidents here and the American national security state. And what leverage do presidents have in this situation Reagan allowed many, many more UN resolutions critical of Israel to get through the UN Security Council than Obama and Biden combined, right? Because there's this idea out there that Democrats aren't as supportive of Israel as Republicans are. Historically, that is not the case. Reagan put a lot of pressure on Israel in 1982 to quit it in Beirut because he was correct in saying that that was not in U.S. interests.
Israel must have learned that there is no way it can impose its own solutions on hatreds as deep and bitter as those that produce this tragedy. If it seeks to do so, it will only sink more deeply into the quagmire that looms before it. Those outsiders who have fed the flames of civil war in Lebanon for so many years need to learn that the fire will consume them too if it is not put out.
Well, and you want to talk about a withdrawal, and withdrawal after
that's right.
a whole lot of bloodshed. You know, it is
Lebanon.
remarkable that Reagan is remembered as being resolute, that Reagan is remembered as being ethically driven or driven by his morals, driven by his values. And yet we have to remember that one of the things that Reagan did, I think to his great credit, is take the short-term hit, pulling troops out of Lebanon, admitting that they shouldn't have been there or that things were not going well, because better to admit we're wrong today than to be there 20 years from now still burying people.
The administration that secretly and illegally sold weapons to Iran through Israel and then took the proceeds to fund the Contras in Central America.
Well, that's later. I'm talking about the Lebanon.
No, I'm adding another layer here.
Right. Well, listen, mistakes were made.
We did not, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
Yes. To debunk the Reagan mythology, although he does have a very significant foreign policy legacy.
But those who critique Joe Biden, I want going back to Afghanistan for a second, those who critique Joe Biden for pulling out of Afghanistan have to look at Reagan, and they have to look at Clinton in Somalia and say, in each of those cases, presidents decide to take the politically unpopular move of, if not admitting defeat, then bugging out, rather than getting involved in a quagmire.
Cut and run is the term that some people use. Did Biden make the pivot to Asia?
I think every president since Harry Truman has been trying to pivot to Asia. So I think what Biden has done in Asia is not unique. And if you want to say this is part of his doctrine, let's go ahead. Reestablishing that America is going to engage its partners and its allies in a constructive manner to try to create a greater web of security, rather than blustering from crisis to crisis to crisis.
Yeah, I don't think he's a visionary here either. In this part of the world, I think those countries, who am I talking about? Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, which is a U.S. treaty ally, Australia are afraid of China, and they do want U.S. assistance there. I think that is more of the trigger here, or the impetus for a stronger network, a stronger alliance, rather than anything Biden has done per se. Although he does deserve credit for exploiting this opening, because those countries, as mentioned, are more worried about China than anything else.
That observation shouldn't surprise anybody, because remember what Winston Churchill used to say about allies? He said, the only thing worse than having allies is having no allies, because allies stink. They have their own ideas. They want to do things their own way, and you have to appease them all the time. Thucydides made the point that most alliances are built upon a common enemy, not upon common interests. So NATO is formed because people are jointly concerned about the Soviet Union. The Quad deals and the American security integration in Asia from the 1960s till yesterday are fundamentally about other countries being more dangerous. In the case of today, the fear of China. If there was no China, there would be no need for those kinds of security arrangements, or they wouldn't be as robust.
I want to see a restraint doctrine, but that's difficult to do when you have all these sprawling security commitments, because what are you supposed to do about Taiwan? And there is legislation, I don't know if you would call it a treaty, but there is the Taiwan Defense Act, or I'm not getting the term right. I mean, it goes back many, many decades to the aftermath of the communist victory in mainland China. The United States is obligated to defend Taiwan, although we don't say it explicitly.
Right.
This is just an example. We don't have to get into the nitty-gritty on this, but I would like to see a restraint doctrine, but I don't see that happening anytime soon.
I think we're seeing a restraint doctrine. I really do, especially let's go back to Ukraine. Biden has been very clear and criticized roundly for it certainly by the Ukrainians in particular, that he is going to, at every time he increases aid, is going to make that a struggle and increases the types of weaponry and the releases on how the weaponry can be used, especially inside Russia, because his primary concern, more than the security of Ukraine, is the security of the United States and keeping a wider war from growing. So, yeah, it may be in Ukraine's best interest to have long-range weapons, he has argued consistently, but that's not in Europe's interest or America's interest, America's in particular. So I think that is restraint, because I think another president would have given him a blanker check.
Well, on the subject of Trump, he gives NATO a hard time, but I think even there, people overstate his hostility to NATO. I don't think the U.S. is going to pull out of NATO.
You and I disagree on that. I think it's time to take the man at his word. Every American president since Harry Truman has complained about NATO and has complained that our NATO allies are not doing enough. And when you reopen up the documents, and right now we're getting documents from the 1990s, but I can't say about the 2000s, but I can say about the 90s, about the 80s, about the 70s, and about the 60s and 50s. Every time American policymakers said, we really wish Europe would do more for its own security, they've actually included a little parentheses that says, but thank God they don't, because the last thing we want are Germans and French being armed to the teeth. That hasn't worked out so well. We are very happy when we are the primary dominant military force. So we can complain, and Obama complained about NATO not paying enough. But at the end of the day, the alternative may actually be worse.
A European army that Macron has talked about.
When the Europeans, the French and the British in particular, made the decision that they were going to depose Gaddafi in Libya, the first thing they needed to do was to knock out Libyan air defenses before they could move their troops in. Only the United States had the capability to safely knock out air defenses, which meant Obama basically had a veto on whether or not they went into that operation. That's a power that the president of the United States and the American people should relish, that they are strong enough, despite our quibbles about and our qualms about how much we're spending on our military, that we are strong enough to make sure that our allies don't do things that are directly opposite to what we want.
Yeah, the idea of a European army coming to Ukraine's defense, I mean, that would be a huge war.
If I've learned one thing from studying American foreign policy, it's that Americans have determined that the real problem with international relations and foreign relations is all the foreigners, because foreigners get into wars and we get drawn into it.
That's a 1914 and 1939 mentality.
It is. By the way, I'm not particularly impressed by the argument that Vladimir Putin is a rapacious dictator who will just march into Poland and then march into central Germany and then march into France. I think that's...
Well, how would he do that when it's taken 2+ years to still fight over the Donbass?
So the rhetoric that we have that stems from stopping Hitler and the criticisms of appeasement continues to dominate the way we think about foreign policy. But that doesn't mean that it's not right to stop Putin in Ukraine. The president may feel the need to say that we're worried about Poland and Latvia and other places to get the political support for the aid that we want. But I think we can be reasonable enough to say that we should want Ukraine defended from Russia without having to worry about overextending our criticism and our critique of Vladimir Putin.
Well, if you want to get Americans to support your policy, which resonates more? We need to support this country, even though it's just a regional war that is not a vital interest of the United States. Or this is a front line in a global struggle between democracy and autocracy, and democracy must survive. My point earlier about language being a prison.
We need to look at what people do and not just what they say. You could argue, if Biden really believed that Vladimir Putin is this era's
Adolf Hitler, like some historians have argued, but go ahead.
Yeah, and that we are in a Manichaean struggle for survival between autocracy and democracy, then why the hell is he restraining the Ukrainians from killing Russians? Well, obviously, it's because he doesn't want the wider war. There are some things more important to him than Ukrainian security, and that's making sure there's not a nuclear war.
Nations have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. They have the freedom to set their own course and choose with whom they will associate. But that still leaves plenty of room for diplomacy and for de-escalation. That's the best way forward for all parties, in our view. We'll continue our diplomatic efforts in close consultation with our allies and our partners. As long as there is hope of diplomatic resolution that prevents the use of force and avoids incredible human suffering that would follow, we will pursue it.
Well, soon, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East, NATO, the Quad countries, and Indo-Pacific, they will be some other president's responsibility. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Sean Wilentz returns to discuss the Electoral College, Trumpism, and what is at stake in this coming election. That's as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.